Romans Part 3, Lesson 1. This is the beginning of Part 3. We have gone through Parts 1 and Parts 2. I know that I guess I'm saying the most obvious things, but this is the beginning of this part. We're going to do a review today. This is overview. This is flying really high. We're not going deep today at all. I'm going to try not to go deep today at all and get stuck. But lots of information, and we need to get to it. But basically, we're going to be looking at your observation, not your observation worksheet, your at-a-glance chart. If you have one at the back if you're in your lesson, or maybe you've written it down in your Bible, if you've got that space, which I do in mine. But we're going to set kind of the setting and the context of Romans a little bit. Mainly, is this one of those times when I say we got to get our minds back into this, right? It's been a while. We've had a good long break. So let's talk about some of the things, and some of this goes way back to Romans Part 1. But we want to review each time to know a little bit about over the whole book of Romans. Like, what are some of the things that we know? For one thing, what type of literature is this? It's a letter. It's also called an epistle, but that is the word for letter. The most obvious thing that we know about any letter in time, even now, is there's two things. It comes from someone and it's to someone, right? And those can be plurals, not just necessarily one person. In this case, who wrote the letter of Romans? Paul. How do we know that? He identifies himself. Differently than our letters of today, we usually start with dear whoever. Paul starts his letters or his epistles with Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, or some phrase like that. He introduces himself. Who do we know this letter is to? Christians in Rome. Right. So that's why the book is called Romans. It's written to people who are physically in the city of Rome, and they are also believers. He's writing to believers. Probably in their groups, the potential is that there might be non-believers there too, but he's writing to believers. Okay, what are the two categories of people that are believers in the Roman Catholic Church? I mean, not Roman Catholic, sorry. Sorry, the Roman, the book that this is written to, sorry, the people this is written to. Jews and Gentiles, right? That's true of, that's how God views all people when we start looking at Scripture, is they're either Jew or they're not. And that's the rest of the world. So in the case of this, he's going to be talking to those two groups here as well. So that also tells you that there are Jews in Rome, right? At this point in time. Later we know that there is an expulsion of Jews from Rome, right? We studied that. So what are some of the circumstances that are going on during this time? Things that we found in this book. We didn't have to go to commentaries. We found at the very first of Romans and the very last of Romans just some general statements made. What are they dealing with? Do you remember?
Wrong teachings.
Yeah, wrong teachings. And Paul is all about clarifying that, right? Okay. What else do we find out about Paul in relation to the people of Rome? He's never been there. He's never met them, but he's a Roman citizen. Yes, he is a Roman citizen, not a Roman city citizen, but a Roman Empire citizen. And that is true. So he has that in common with them as well. And he's never been there, but what is his longing? His longing is to go there, and his plan is to go there. He talks about that. He plans to go visit them. He even has a when he's going to go. Now, is that what happened? No. He did not go of his own volition, right? He was taken in chains. He was taken as a prisoner. But at this point, he wants to go. Now, something else that we know about Paul as we study different parts of Scripture to get a little bit of an understanding about Paul's pattern is always to go places where the gospel has not been established. He goes there before anyone else. That's what God sent him to do, so that he can do what? Spread the gospel, spread the word, lay that foundation. Right, he wants to lay that foundation. So when he's writing to the Romans, and he's never been there, what's something that we can know about them as far as that foundation is concerned?
They know the truth then.
I'm sorry?
they will know the truth.
They will know because Paul's going to tell them, right? But prior to Paul writing, they haven't had that foundation laid, okay? So what do you think the book of Romans is about? Laying a foundation. What do we call the book of Romans? And this is not something that comes out of it, but something that Kay talks about, probably others as well. We call it the what of our faith? Constitution of our faith. All right, we use the word constitution in our country, meaning it is the founding document. It's a document that sets forth what we are about. If you want to know the ways of the American government, the American country, United States of America that is, then you read our Constitution. Now, it's supposed to be kind of set in stone. People are trying to change that now, just like the Word of God. You know, it's very clear, things are black and white, but people want to come along and say, oh, well, that doesn't apply to today. You know, and I'm not equating our Constitution to the Word of God. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying in the way people operate. So we call Romans the Constitution of our faith. It is Paul doing what he can't do in person, you know, but he's going to do even prior to getting there. So we know these things about the people in Rome. They are believers. They've had the gospel presented. They've come to the knowledge of truth, at least the ones he's writing to, the ones that profess that, but they haven't had that solid foundation laid, okay? Now, do you ever think about that in your world? Or even in your own personal life? Was there a time when that foundation had not been laid? But maybe you were saved as a child, right? And you may have known the truth you needed to know. The gospel is so simple a child can understand it. God doesn't make it an age thing. You know, you graduate from college, here's your diploma, and now, you know, it's not that at all. It is so simple that even a child can understand it. But more often than not, we're not going to think of an 8-year-old understanding deep doctrinal truths, right? That's something they learn over time. Okay, I mentioned it in our prayer, but what is that time from your salvation to your graduation into heaven? What do we call that time? Sanctification. Okay, we are sanctified. We are eternally set, which means set apart. The word sanctified does, but we're in a process of. Remember, as we live, we're in a process of sanctification, of while we're living out and learning about the thing that God has implanted in us. And, you know, He made it true of us. Now we get to actually walk in it and learn, okay? So that's what Paul is doing somewhat to these Romans, is they did not have those solid truths. So if you don't, what's going to happen in your life? You get saved and then what? Yeah, you veer off. You don't have that solid ground underneath you. You don't know the truths to walk.
You get sidelined.
Absolutely. Or mired. You know, just think about walking in a miry mud and you just get stuck and you can't get yourself out. So that's what part of what Paul's trying to do. In learning a few of those little things, all of that, almost everything that we just talked about, comes straight from the Word out of the book of Romans. A little bit of Paul's life and his ways came from Acts and other places. But this is what I love about inductive Bible study. We didn't have to go to a commentary to find out any of that. It's right there. Most of this information is in the first of Romans, through 17, I think. Romans 1 through 17. And then the other is in the last chapters, as part of 11 and into 12. We just get those like personal statements that Paul makes, and in them you start learning some of the history. And then a lot of times in the middle also, whatever topic he's dealing with, he brings up what they are believing or thinking or what has to be taken aside, right? Mm-hmm. What is Paul's method? What is his, throughout the book of Romans and he does what? He poses ask a question, and then he answers it.
May it never be.
May it never be, you're right. A lot of the questions have within them, even if people that understand the construction of the sentence, like the Greek construction, will tell you it's an obvious answer at the end. There's no question about it. It's no. But then he also says, heaven forbid, or may it never be, depending on your translation.
He also uses himself oftentimes as an example. Very good.
He uses himself as an example. Paul is called the great exhorter. If you understand what the word exhortation means, or an exhorter is the person who comes alongside. It's the idea of putting their arm around someone who is here, You know, you may be a little bit more down the path spiritually, not spiritually superior. I'm not trying to propose that. But maybe, like in Paul's case, he has that solid foundation and they don't. So he's mentoring. So he would come alongside them where they are and say, this is where you need to go. Let me walk with you. That's the idea of an exhorter. What he does is pose questions and answers them. That is his method of moving through the dialogue, the text. But also, if you go through any of Paul's epistles, including Romans, you see a lot of imperative statements. Now, what if you go back to your grammar in school, what is an imperative statement? Do you remember? Usually you is the subject and it's implied. So the first word isn't the subject, but the subject is implied, meaning you, and then what's next? It's a verb. It's a command. Right? So imperative sentences are commands. But if you look at Paul, sometimes it is a command. In other words, this isn't just something I'm suggesting. Other times it's more of a suggestion. Like what would be good for you is. Like even in our prayers, and I won't mention it on the camera, but there's one in there that you hear me every time saying, the best thing for her. What would be good for her would be. And so I'm an exhorter. I would like her to go from where she is to the place that she needs to go. Not because I'm pointing out wrongdoing. Not because I like finding problems that people are in or blaming them for things or titling them with something. But because I care that where they are is damaging to them. Okay, so that's an exhorter. That's what Paul is. If you didn't know that about him, that's your nice little extra. Read through. I have, in certain studies in my Bible, I have like a double arrow, double lined arrow like this, beside his commands, his exhortations. And then I might write out an E or a C for exhortation or command to try to determine. Sometimes it's hard to determine. I do that because it's like bullets. Boom, boom, bullet points, not like bullets. That's a little stronger than I wanted. But just like, you just see, boom, boom, boom. And then if you just listed those, you have a call to action, for yourself. Where do you fall in those? We all could go back and look at any of those lists and go, I was better at some time. I've fallen away on some. It's always good. Okay, so that's kind of getting us to where the historical setting for the book of Romans, a little bit of the background, and then as we looked over the entire book of Romans, all the way through all 16 chapters, what did we find to be the overall theme of the entire book?
The righteous shall live by faith.
Okay, yes, we've got it. Thank you. The righteous shall live by faith. Okay. Where in particular do you find that statement? Do you remember?
1:16.
Very good. Because those are where we actually found these words, but also those are the themes, verse themes for the entire book, right? They're also the themes of the first chapter. But that is, so again, even within that, don't you see the exhortation? The righteous shall live by faith. Okay? It's not a suggestion. Even though I kind of said an exhortation, a suggestion, it's really not. It's still really, this is how you should, and it's for your good. Okay.
Wait.
Yes.
You said it's an exhortation. Why is it an exhortation or a command?
Well, can I really command you to live by faith?
Okay.
God can. Really, it's the idea of if I were. Sorry. Thank you. Got to say we're all enough noise going on. Sorry, I should say for the video, we've got the workers outside, so you're hearing drills and sorry, and that was my dog. Those were my dogs. So in the sense, this is a good one. In the sense of this being an exhortation more so than a command, you're not a Christian if you're not living by faith. Therefore, you could say it's a command, but really it's more of you are or you're not. It's really more of look at your life. If you're not walking in faith, if you're not living by faith, God says anything that we do that is not in faith is sin. And you know, in our last section, of course, we also need to do our segment divisions, I guess, before we get into the individual. Well, we'll go into the individual chapters and let's do the segment divisions. But we can talk about them. Part 1 dealt with the first 5 chapters, right? What 2 subjects did we deal with in those first 2 chapters? Chapter 1 through chapter 3, verse 21 dealt with what? Sin. Sin and salvation, but the 1 through 321 dealt with sin. Remember, this is the image of the snake coming in the garden, right? These are K's images. Okay, and then 321 through 5 dealt with salvation, right? And then last time we dealt with chapters 6 through 8, we dealt with sanctification. Remember, the praying in the halo. And then chapters 9 through 11, which is what we're going to focus on this time, are about sovereignty, right? You know, God hooking his finger and then telling you what to do. And then chapters 12 through the end are dealing with what subject? Service. And she did the, you know, throwing the tennis ball up and serving. Okay, those are Kay's pictures to help you remember. So we're going to be in this section on Romans part 3. We're going to be dealing with the sovereignty issue, which is awesome. It's really one of my favorites. But when we dealt with the sanctification part, there was a whole lot in there about, you know, how we are to live. There was something that was said just a minute ago and went out of my head. Sorry. I'm going to have one of those days. So let's look at chapter by chapter. Even in the first part, I've already said chapter 1 through verse 17, 1 through 17, deals with what?
Gospel?
Yeah, its gospel is what? The gospel is the power of God, what? For what purpose is the gospel? It's in verses 16 and 17. I am not ashamed.
The righteous shall live by faith.
Well, the righteous shall live by faith, but what is it about the gospel? The gospel is the power of God for salvation, right?
Yeah.
To the Jew first and then to the Greek. And then also, it talks about the righteousness of God is revealed. That's through verse 17. And then verses 18 through 32, while you've got the righteousness of God revealed, verses 18 through 32 start talking about what else is revealed from God.
God has shown himself through creation.
Definitely. And that's his righteousness revealed in creation, so it's outside of us. You know, I always point out these windows because they can't see, but we can. But it also, he plants it within us, right? That's how he shows, he presents and lets us know that no one has any excuse because it's right there. So we have God's righteousness revealed. What are the last part of chapter 1? What else is revealed from God? In contrast, it's a contrast. Thank you. The wrath of God. God's wrath is revealed. And this is God's judgment also of sin. But what group of people are more focused on in chapter 1? What sin in what realm of people?
Jews,
No, not for chapter 1.
Gentiles.
Gentiles, yeah. So this is the judgment, as it's revealed, as it's described as the judgment of the Gentile sin primarily, although it can be true of Jews too. Nothing that is said is like just specific necessarily to one group if it's talking about it. Chapter 2 deals with the judgment of whose sin?
The Jews.
Right. So the judgment of the Jews' sin in chapter 2. The conclusion for both is there is no excuse. Right? There's no excuse. That's what it was said. Okay, in chapter 3, verses 1 to 20, what do we find? You can look in your Bibles, I don't mind.
The Jews were entrusted with oracles of God, but all were guilty of not obeying.
Yes, so the all part, all have what?
Sin.
All have sinned, right? There are none that are righteous. And it says, no, not one. So that's establishing in those first 20 verses of chapter 3. This is also the end of a segment, and this is the segment on sin. Starting in chapter 3, verse 21, through the end of that chapter, what are we justified by? Right. So we're justified by faith
Apart from works.
apart from works of the law.
Faith in Jesus Christ.
Yes. And that is very important,
Yes.
because a lot of people throw that word around. You know, he's a man of faith, or she's a person of faith, or whatever. But unless you really are talking about what that faith is. And so, how are we justified? We're justified by faith apart from works of the law. What were the Jews counting on?
The law.
The law. Being the literal holders of the law, possessors of it, but also being the keepers, meaning supposedly following the law, right? They believed that that gave them something, right? It's not a bad thing to do.
Still today they do, don't they? Don't they have the laws written?
On their phylacteries.
Yeah.
Yeah, they wear them, yeah,
Yes.
visible sign, and put them on their doors and stuff. What were you saying back there, Sandy?
No,
Okay.
my husband read something this morning, Jonathan Kahn, I don't know if you ever read it.
I do.
But today he said that millennials that are Jewish are turning over, they do believe in Christ.
Ah.
There's more and more of them believing that he's a part of their life.
That's
I mean,
awesome.
it was really promising, it sounded really.
Now you're talking about millennials, like the younger people,
Yeah, the
like,
younger people today. are
right, the
accepting-
20s, 30s.
And it's the ones that are non-believers, of course, they're falling away.
Okay,
You know, the Christian millennials.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to call them Christians, but you know.
right. Well, Paul calls them so-called, meaning they may claim to be. There's still a vast majority, I think it's like 80-something% of people in America claim to be Christian. And I just heard some statistics the other day that if you go to church like somewhere in the 1 to 2 times a month, you're considered a frequenter. Yeah, I mean, that's not what I would say, but you know, if you're half the time is basically, and there's people that have their name on a roll, might go once or twice a year, and if you ask, they'll tell you that they're Christians. Some will get really belligerent about it. Well, you can be a Christian, not go to church.
In Revelation, wasn't it, didn't they say, somewhere it says that there'll be more and more people falling away
Oh yeah, yeah.
before the end.
Right, and actually, while we studied Revelation, and it definitely talks about, but it's actually in 1st or 2nd Thessalonians, I think it's 1st, that it talks about there'll be the apostasy prior to the man of lawlessness being revealed. That's in Thessalonians. We looked at it while we were studying Revelation. It's very much a part of, we kind of know the timing of that. And when we studied Revelation, if you remember, all of that time frame is almost completely focusing on coming back to Judaism prior to, like the temple worship specifically. So what I hear more often than not, though, in church, I mean in the Christian realm and world, is when we talk about, there is apostasy. Apostasy is a word meaning falling away. Okay, but when we're talking about the apostasy, when we're talking about that falling away prior to the man of lawlessness being revealed, I believe it's specific to coming to Judaism and falling away from Judaism, not coming to Christianity and falling away from Christianity, because it's centered around the man of lawlessness being revealed. Where? When? What's he going to do? Do you remember? How's he going to be revealed? He's going to walk in where? Temple. He's going to go walk into the temple, sit down, declare himself as God, and he's going to stop the sacrifices and grain offerings. Is that Christianity? No. So I believe the apostasy it's talking about is centered more on back to Judaism, because it's going to be revived in the sense of the temple worship and everything else, and they're going to fall away from that. Now, could it mean Christians? Yes. Yes, it could talk about that. But we as Christians don't ever think about anything but ourselves. And we don't sacrifice. But we're not, whenever I hear anybody talking about the apostasy, they're almost always talking about the apostate church, which is very real. It's very true. But I believe that specific prophecy is about apostate Judaism. Now, am I going to die on that hill? No. I'm going to die on that hill. I'm going to be raptured. So that's my plan. God knows I've got my ticket. I'm joking. So. Okay, so going on to chapter 4. What do we see? What is kind of a change in focus starting in chapter 4? Abraham.
Justified by faith.
Right. It said he believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness.
Prior to circumcision and the law.
And it's part from, is that what you said?
Prior to.
Oh, yes. That was what we established about Abraham's life. And yes, that is so critical to understand when Paul is going through this and he's addressing what the Jews are counting on. They were counting, we've already talked about, they were counting on righteousness being a work of the law. Then they were counting on they're justified, he's saying, if you're justified like Abraham was justified, he was justified by belief or by faith. It's always about faith. And so he's making this point over and over again. But they're counting on being genetically Jewish. They're counting on being religiously Jewish. They're counting on being possessors and supposed keepers of the law. And Paul is ripping all that away. Because,
I love verse 2.
okay.
For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
It is, and that's so true of us. I mean, Paul says in other places, you know, salvation is grace by faith through, not of works, lest any man should boast, right? Same thing here. If anybody would have reason to boast, it would be Abraham, right? You know, they would certainly boast for him, but he has nothing to boast about in his salvation. God did it, right? So it was reckoned to him, meaning this word, remember, is an accounting term. Put to his account, like putting a deposit in somebody's bank account that they can then live off of, right? But not money he put there, but money God put there, and it's not money, but you know what I mean. Righteousness was reckoned, it was put to his account because he believed God. And he believed prior to circumcision, as Sandy was saying, he believed 500 years or so prior to the law ever being given. So it's not based on the law. If you're a Christian, if you're a believer, you are a child of Abraham, not by genetics, but by believing just like Abraham believed. And this is one of those places that I really like to stop and hang out for just a second and say, in most of our experience, or mine, and I believe it's true of most, experience with church, growing up into this point, you hear this huge division between, or separation of the New Testament times from the Old Testament times. And there are some differences, right? Old Testament means Old Covenant. New Testament means New Covenant. All right, there is a difference. And there is a separation. But salvation has been the same throughout. Times were different. What they were exposed to were different. What the law came later, it wasn't always, etc. There are some differences. Some people even start talking about dispensations, but I'm just going to say there were some different times, but God's salvation has been the same from the garden to what hasn't yet even happened, all the way through, not just this book, but the events that are going to happen that are talked about in this book, okay? So not just when we got Revelation. So it's so important to have that grounded. Okay, now chapter 5 talks about what? What's chapter 5 about?
As God in Christ.
Okay, I hear Adam. I hear the name Adam. Is that what I was hearing y'all say? Okay, we have peace, yeah. We have peace with
Many
God,
made righteous by Jesus' death.
right? There's a lot of themes in this. Many made righteous by Jesus' death. We're reconciled. This peace with God is our reconciliation. We're reconciled to God through Christ. Okay, and so this is another segment division of the book. So we had sin, and here we have what? This is salvation, right? So in our part 1, that's the chapters that we covered. We covered both sin and salvation. Okay? I always think it's important to stop and notice the order that it's given in. Do you think that potentially we might get something from this and how we might talk to someone who isn't saved? Do we jump down to the service they need to be doing? No. We probably need to start all the way back with everyone's a sinner. I was a sinner. I was born. Everyone's born that way. Everyone's born literally on a path to hell. It's not the way we want to look at it, but it's true. That precious brand new baby. And I remember the first time I ever heard Kay say this. She went to the hospital when her first grandchild or one of her grandchild was born. She's holding this precious little, I think, boy. Don't remember the gender. And like, oh, what a precious little sinner. Is it true? Yeah. They're precious to us. They're a gift from God, but they're born a sinner. You're born on the path. You're headed that way. Something has to happen. Okay. So in chapter 6, we start looking at what?
Dead to sin.
Dead to sin. But the contrast is dead. What are we alive to?
God.
We're alive to
Jesus
God.
Christ.
Right. In chapter 7, what are we dead to?
Law.
The dead to the law, right? In chapter 8, we're dead and alive. What are we alive to? Or alive in?
Spirit of Jesus Christ.
We're alive in the Spirit, and we're more than conquerors. And this segment is what we dealt with last time, and it's a segment on sanctification. The word sanctify means to set apart. We are set apart. We're set apart from the time of our salvation, set apart from the world. We now have to remember we're dead to sin, we're dead to the law, we're alive to God, we're alive in the Spirit. We're alive all because of Christ.
What is that row on the left-hand side?
Sanctification.
Sanctification.
Yeah, that's the segment that we dealt with. Okay? Now, starting in chapter 9, this is the segment that we're going to be looking at, 9, 10, and 11. What's 9 about?
Paul's sorrow for Israel and God's mercy.
Okay. Paul is sorrowful for Israel. Why? What was his focus?
Because they're servers in the law, not of faith.
Right. And Paul is a Jew. He loves his people.
Yes.
He has that, like you're saying, he has that compassion and that love for them. He sorrows over them because of where they are. Okay? Which is an awesome part of this, and we're going to learn so much about putting that in its proper place. Because again, the church has a tendency, we may not particularly in here, but the church has a tendency over the years to just say, God's finished with the Jews. And we're superior to them. That's been historically, not saying it's us, but historically that's been the view. The world hates the Jews. Right now, as a nation, we've done pretty well with our relationship with the nation of Israel, but we're wavering on that. We have pulled away, and I have great fear in that, because going all the way back to the covenant promises made by God to Abraham in the very, very beginning in his call, God says, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. We need to be on the blessing group.
Yes.
Right. So individually, you will be held accountable for that. But as a nation, we will be impacted by the decisions our government makes where the nation of Israel is concerned. It's very concerning. So there's the sovereignty of God is talked about here, and this is God's choice of Israel. Remember, our sovereign God chose Israel. We will look at this in great detail, and it is vital to understand how they were chosen, how God views it, how does it relate to us, because it's true of us as well. In other words, let me just put a question to you, kind of rhetorical almost. Did Israel, as a nation, which was in one person, but they grew and grew and grew, did they choose God?
He chose them.
He chose them. Did he choose them because of what great and awesome things they're going to do for him? No. What is their pattern? Their pattern is human nature. But what is their pattern? It's of rebellion, idolatry, spiritual adultery, not being faithful to God. He views them as his wife. And they spread their legs for every comer, every person who passes by. I mean, that's the imagery God gives. But when he talks about Israel as when he called them out as a nation, he describes them as a child still in its afterbirth that's been cast off. That's about as nasty a graphic picture that you can paint. Unwanted, not great, not desirable, actually so undesirable they were cast out like trash. Something our culture is doing today, right? That's the picture God gives. Not that he saw Israel that way, like he's saying bad things. He's saying, you didn't have the ability to choose me. I chose you. I threw my skirt around you. I threw my protection over you. I cleaned you up. I let you grow up. I put your garments and your jewelry and everything on you. I wooed you for my wife. And that's the nation of Israel. But we can see that for ourselves as well, right? Because again, this was something that God just had to pull all, well, I hope he's pulled all. I mean, I know he could. I hope that I've gotten out all those roots of wrong thinking that I might have grown up with or whatever else, especially even after I was saved, thinking God chose me because I was worth choosing. That I had some great things to do for him.
Sounds like pride.
It's very much pride. It's very much pride. And that's what I'm saying, just strip all of that away. Get yourself where you see yourself as that discarded, unwanted child in its afterbirth. Has no hope, will die, not even wanted. See yourself that way. It's hard to do, but see yourself that way and see yourself as what God saw in you. Not that you were going to do great things for you, but he threw his love on you. That's where your worth is. That's where your value is God chose you. It's a beautiful thing when you let yourself be as low as you can possibly get yourself and realize from there God raised you up. It's an incredible, incredible thing. And it deals with the sovereignty of God. That's why I'm going to love this part. Last part was kind of hard. Remember the whole sanctification? I mean, we had bloody toes all the time. Okay. In chapter 10, we're talking about the sovereignty of God. In chapter 9, what are we going to talk about in chapter 10?
Israel.
We're going to talk about Israel's rejection, right? Israel's rejection of what?
The righteousness of God.
Yes. And I'm just going to say of God, but yes, of the righteousness of God. But also, this is also talking about the responsibility of man. How many times have you heard me say or put my arms up like two chops, sovereignty of God, responsibility of man, or maybe I do it either way. Remember? This is where I get this. I've done Romans once before. This was so firm. It is something I feel like it has to be said over and over again. You've got the sovereignty of God throughout Scripture, but for whatever reason, God lays the responsibility of man out there too. We have a responsibility. We're going to learn about that in relation to the sovereignty of God. Now in chapter 11, we've got God's rejection of Israel already, but Israel's rejection. Israel's rejection led to what? It led to the Gentiles what? Yes. Or reconciliation. But while Israel has rejected God, what's God's response? What has God done towards Israel? Has God rejected Israel?
No.
No. So we need to remember God has not rejected Israel. Very important, because this is teaching there is teaching today that God is done with Israel. And it's within some of the strongest Christian speakers. It's amazing to me how they can come to that conclusion. Now, this section on 9, 10, and 11, I've already told you, but what is this section on? Sovereignty, right. Sovereignty. So now we've got 12, 13, 14, and the kind of first part of 15. So it's chapter 15, 1, 13. And then you have 15, 1, 14, I'm sorry, 15, 14 through 33, and then chapter 16. So we can finish up our outline here. In chapter 12, what is the main idea?
We have different gifts and use them.
We have different gifts and we use them, and those come from God. The very, very beginning tells us kind of the overall theme, and that is that we are to do what? Present what?
Our bodies is living
Yes.
sacrifice, living and holy.
Living and holy, and that is our reasonable form of worship, our acceptable form of worship. We're not to be conformed, we'll be transformed by the renewing of our minds. And then chapter 13, this section is on service. It's very practical parts. So this is going to be more like not just the sanctification, how do you live, but then how do you live all this out. So you've got present your bodies. What in chapter 13 do you have?
Put on Christ, walk in faith,
Okay.
love one another.
Yes, there's a lot of, again, those exhortations, love one another, fulfill the law.
Yes, yes.
And it's interesting that we throw in here fulfill the law because we've been told we're dead to the law. So we're going to always struggle with what does law have to do in the life of a believer? That was one of the questions that kept coming up for me when I did Romans before, is I got that concept of sovereignty of God and the responsibility of man, and get that firmly in your mind. But beyond that, it's what does the law have to do? And it's that greased pig, remember, where you think you have it, you got your hands around it, it's right there, and then it goes squirts right out, and you gotta go chasing it again. It's very real, it's tangible, it has a stench even sometimes, but basically it's not something that's easy to hold on to or completely grasp, but we're working on it, and ask God to give you wisdom in that. But the idea is the law does have its place. We are to fulfill the law, but we're dead to it. If we're trying to follow the law for salvation, we need to be that needs to just die. That idea needs to die. And yet, while Jesus was on this earth, in his earthly ministry, he fulfilled the law. He went to the feasts and festivals. He didn't sacrifice for sin. He didn't need to. That's right. He didn't sacrifice for sin. And we don't need to. Why? Because he's already sacrificed for us, right? Okay. So figuring out the law's place in your life is important. In chapter 14, what is the theme of chapter 14?
Except one who is weak.
Do
Okay.
not judge.
Okay.
Don't judge your brother.
Or look at the brother with contempt. So don't judge your brother or look at the brother with contempt. we should be looking at the weaker as someone, again, that we want to put our arm around and help get to a stronger place. Chapter 15 through 1 through 13 is part of service, and what is its theme? Accept one another. Chapter 15, verses 14 to 33 is just a personal message from Paul. He starts getting personal, naming names, not in a bad way, necessarily. And then the last part, you've got the greetings, you've got some warnings, and you've got some kind of what we call the benediction. Just like a closing. Again, these letters aren't in the same form as if you took a typing class or took a class in school where you were learning how to write a letter. Our form of our letters form a little differently, where here Paul introduces himself, and down here he closes and concludes, but it doesn't say sincerely Paul, like ours might. When we look at some of the other groupings and other segment divisions, if you go down here to this part, so you've got chapters 1 through chapter 11, you're dealing more with doctrine, right? So it's a doctrinal message. And then from 12 on, you've got, as opposed to that, more of a practical message. And then there's some other sub parts to it that would help us understand it. You understand segment divisions, all they do is help us to see like a pattern of thought. Paul is very methodical. He's very good at progressing his thought process and thing. He's not just like randomly putting things down on paper, right? So we see times through here where like there was a focus on Abraham for a while, several chapters. We're talking about Abraham. We saw, like in chapter 1 to chapter 2, kind of a focus on the Gentiles' sin versus a focus on the Jews' sin. Because they are going to act a little differently if they're walking in their churches and their lives. When Paul is dealing with people, Paul was sent to the Gentiles primarily, but his pattern was always to go find the Jews in any city first. Kind of give them the opportunity first. Remember, Jesus came to the Jew first, and then to the rest of the world. But the purpose was to equip the Jews to be what God had always wanted them to be, the light on a hill. You know, the city that would draw. People were to come, and again, what had the Jews done all that time? They were the people of God, and they were supposed to separate themselves by behavior. They were not supposed to separate themselves any more than we are from interacting with people. But how do you do that? And that is, we saw in our covenant study that the word friend is a covenant word, remember? Abraham was called, and is still called, the friend of God. He's the only one in the Old Testament that's called that. I know, it's awesome. But what are we called? By Jesus. Well, we're called children of God, but Jesus said, you're no longer slaves, you're now my friends. So we are Jesus' friend. That is a covenant word. So how do we live that out in the world? We have a tendency to call just about anybody we know a friend, right? We should not.
We use that word very
We use it lightly, right? We use it very lightly.
So what do you use?
I will call them an acquaintance. I won't say to you, you're my acquaintance. I don't say that. But if I'm really thinking about the word, I do separate. And only Christians can be my friends. I can only be in a covenant relationship with Christians. I cannot be, I should not be, because we can be married to unbelievers, can we not? Right? We can have family members that are unbelievers. We can have children that are unbelievers, right? And we can have co-workers. We can have, hopefully, well, bosses, obviously.
So what are they to you?
They are friendlies. I will call them that sometimes. Like, we'd be friendly.
I'll go have lunch with my friendlies today.
Right.
Your acquaintances.
They can be your acquaintances. They can be
Sounds like a battlefield, which it is.
It is. We're in a spiritual battlefield all the time. And I'm really mainly just talking about in your choices of who you're going to spend your time with. You know, the Bible, Proverbs tells us that bad morals corrupt, bad company corrupts good morals, right? So you've probably seen this, but or heard about it. If I stood up on, not one of these cushion chairs, but if I stood up on one of the hard seat chairs and you were down on the ground and I tried to pull you up, I could outweigh you. I could be maybe physically stronger, than you maybe. But how hard would it be for me to pull you off the ground? How easy would it be for you to pull me off the chair, right? The idea there is it's easier to pull somebody down into bad behavior than it is to pull somebody up from their lower behavior.
As
So again,
evidenced by Jesus' time on earth.
absolutely, absolutely. So when Jesus called his followers friends, he was making a difference. He was saying, I no longer call you, I think it's not slave, it's I no longer call you whatever, I now call you friend. It goes, they got it. Let me put it this way. They understood what he's talking about. Just like, remember the group that walked away when he said, you have to eat my flesh and drink my blood or you have no part of me, right? And a group walked away and his close disciples, Peter included, said, what you're saying is a hard thing. We look at that and go, gross, or, like, what was he talking about? When we studied covenant, we got a little better idea of what it was talking about. But they knew, because they lived a covenant culture and mindset. We don't. And in the same way, that's what I'm saying about the word friend, is if you're thinking about it, we sometimes use the word, but if you're thinking about it, stop and step back and go, can I really call that person a friend of mine? Because if they're not a believer, and if they're not walking in God's ways,
Solution to that,
yes,
friend with a capital F or friend with a little f.
okay, yeah,
So people call each other brother.
right, yeah, bro, or whatever.
I'm gonna have lunch with my capital F, all right?
Well, and
I know
again,
what you're trying to
Yeah,
say.
you don't
It's just
have to
that we still have to live in this world.
we have to
with
live in this
people
world,
who are,
and that's what a lot of this
who
is
we have
about.
a relationship with,
Yeah,
and then they're not really believers.
Right.
But we still have a relationship with
right.
them.
So, on your part, as you're thinking about that difference, you need to stop and think, what influence am I
Well,
in
that's
their
what I was
lives?
gonna say. You
Yeah.
can't just walk away from them. That's
No,
what
no.
we're directed to do.
Absolutely. And that when we say set apart, it means we are set apart. We're not going to do the ways of the world. James is very clear. If you're a friend, and he uses that word, friend of the world, you are an enemy of God. It is literally, there's a complete and utter dichotomy there. You cannot be a friend of the world. How would you be a friend of the world? Does that mean you don't have friendly relationships with people that are of the world? And I don't mean just anybody. I mean non-believers. That's the struggle we have. Yes, we do. And we should. Some of them are not by choice. Could be a neighbor, could be coworker, could be your boss. It could be, or could have been, you might not be working right now, but it could be fellow pew warmer. And they're not a Christian. How do you treat them? Yes?
I look at the word friend as love, or someone I trust, someone I have things in common with. So, it's just
I'm
an
not,
introduction to love.
absolutely.
If you love your friends, let's
Yeah.
face it, I mean,
And if we're using the word in the way we tend to use the word, I'm not really like fussing at you and saying you gotta go change your vocabulary. I'm really talking about you thinking about the people in your life. And if you are associating with and acting like people who are not Christians, then you really need to evaluate that. Because again, are you letting them pull you down to the floor and off the chair, or are you pulling them up? Because you can pull them up. Because even though it says bad company corrupts good morals, that's not an absolute. It's a probable. It's something we think about with our kids a lot of times when they're young. Or there was a term that was used starting about, 15, 20 years ago, of missionary dating. And you'd get these young kids saying, oh, but, maybe if I know he's not a Christian, but if I date him, maybe I can influence him. Right, and again, what's probably going to happen?
Well, it's, to me, I immediately have this picture, the dictionary, and it has a word, and then it has first definition, second definition,
Right.
and as you go on, they're less and less significant.
Yeah, first is probably the
Yeah, because
strongest.
they're still, you're friendly with them.
Yeah.
The co-workers, or they're
Sure.
this, or
You
they're
love
neighbors,
them.
or what.
Yeah.
So what are you gonna call them? You know, my friend, you
Yeah.
know, but,
I'm not beating you up for that.
yeah, but we can't change the world we live in,
No.
the language we use.
Exactly.
But it's different depths of meaning.
Yes, and I agree with that. I totally agree with what you said. So I'm not sitting here saying you gotta go change your vocabulary. I'm gonna come be your grammar
You just have
police.
to know the difference.
You need to know the difference, and that's really the point.
We know
is
the difference.
Know the difference,
But
but
we
also
don't
know
want
the
to, we don't want to offend them so deeply
No.
that we
Like,
don't
Yeah,
influence
like
them.
we're gonna get out our Christmas card list and say, you are on this side.
You don't have to maintain some kind of relationship, but if you have any hope.
Right. We have to be, as Jesus said, not of the world, but in the world. Right?
Right.
This is the reality. Or we could be like all on the hill somewhere where you're not gonna come here, even though I've got several rooms. I'm not starting a commune, where we're gonna separate ourselves so much from any interaction with the world. That's not what Jesus ever said we're supposed to do, or
Because we're
God.
supposed to go into the world
Yes.
and
Hope to win them.
hope to win them.
Our
Exactly.
number one ministries is reconciliation. We were reconciled, it's up here, we were reconciled to God through the death of Jesus Christ. We were reconciled, and now we have that. We can't give it unless we have it, but now we turn and tell others, you too need to be reconciled with God. But we can't do that if we're living like them. There's no influence there. We can't do that if we are condoning their behavior, renaming it, saying it's okay with us. We can't do that. Okay? And here's ramping it up one more time. 1 Corinthians 5 talks specifically about a very horrific behavior that Paul is calling out because the church wouldn't. He's calling them out because they didn't. All right? And this is a man that's in their midst of the church who is he calls so-called brother. He uses that term, so-called, meaning that person calls himself a Christian. And he says, this is how you act towards a so-called brother. This is how you act towards the world. You leave judgment to God for the world. But you don't leave judgment for, God too. God judges everything. But we have a responsibility within our churches to be calling out ungodly behavior. So even though it says don't judge, we're going to look at that. Ever? Anybody? No, we are to judge. But we don't condemn. We don't send them anywhere. You heard me in my prayer earlier about my situation, and I look at every person involved in it who is a so-called Christian. They call themselves a Christian, and yet there's not one thing in their behavior that I can possibly believe is a Christian, except for they walk in the doors of a building, probably regularly. Very comfortable there too. But they're doing very ungodly behavior. And they're attacking fellow believers. And so I don't go, oh well, yeah, they probably are. No, I say, I feel it's nicer for me to be praying for their salvation than it is to be excusing their behaviors. Right? You may not agree with me, but I do. I mean, I agree with me.
And that's what you do with homosexuals.
Yes.
Well, you have to pray for them. You don't
Hate them.
hate them, you have to love. They need your love.
Absolutely. And how are we going to reach
And
them?
Jesus
By
loved-
screaming at them?
Jesus loved the sinners.
Yeah. Well, he didn't love them more, but he went to them and was with them. Because remember, he also said, you're right, Jesus said that. He also said, the healthy don't need me. It's the sick that need me. And so we need to see the world in that way. We need to go and minister to them. But again, not go and live like them. Jesus did not go to the parties and party. He went to the parties. But he didn't go and party. And you know what I mean by parties and party, right? I mean, he did not go and act like the sinners.
Yeah.
He was accused of it, though.
He sat with Matthew and the money changers. Is that what
Yes.
they called them?
Yeah. Simon was a tax collector, a different Simon than Simon Peter. And yeah, all of the disciples, he called them out of what they were doing. And Matthew was a tax collector, which meant basically it equaled bad. You know, they usually were grafting. They were usually taking money from people in the wrong way. But yeah, so that's the difference. I'm just saying from thinking about it standpoint, separate out the people in your life between believers and non-believers. And maybe spend more time with the non-believers, but only spend time with a purpose. And it doesn't mean every time you go and you pull out your Bible and you're, you know, teaching them God. It means living it before them, loving on them, giving them an example, and maybe even verbalizing it and saying, I'm praying for this, I'm praying for that. Like I said, there's one of the prayers, and I think y'all know which one, that I'm like, supposedly a Christian, I've been told, has lived for as long as we've had this prayer slip, which has probably been 10 years, in a out-of-wedlock situation. You can't live that long in an out-of-wedlock situation and be a Christian. You can't. That's what we learned in chapters 6 through 8, right? You can't. So my concern and prayer is that she gets saved, that God reveals that to her. Because really, apart from it, the situation she's in, even if she never got saved, which I hope she does, the situation she's in is not for her best. God's ways work, whether you're a Christian or not. God's ways work. Just like if you're a parent to a child, you don't have to be a Christian to parent correctly. There's some really good parents out there that are better than some so-called Christian parents. But God says if you love your child, you'll discipline them. God says, I love you, therefore I discipline you. And in our side-by-side relationships, that's harder. I don't have an authority to discipline you.
Spare the rod, spoil the child.
Spare the rod, spoil the child. I mean, Proverbs goes so far as to say, beat him over the back with a rod. And that's talking about not a little whipping switch. We're talking about, and I'm not advocating that. It's a comparative thing, basically. He's saying, wouldn't it be better to inflict that level of pain and save the child out of their sinful behavior than it would be to just being nice to them?
And God's punishment is far greater than anything a parent could inflict.
That's absolutely true, right? But that's where I know I get into trouble sometimes, maybe not with y'all, when I will say something I have in the past about saying that I question or wonder if somebody's a Christian because I look at their behavior. And I will have back at me, but he went to church, or his parents took him to church. And I'm like, that's great. I am not faulting that, but that doesn't save somebody necessarily. So, I mean, I'm the poster child for that. I was brought up in the church. It kept me out of a lot of bad behavior, gave me some good moral guidelines. I praise God for that. It gave me some, but not much, actual teaching. And when I got saved at 29, which was later, all of that was there for me just to take the next steps and go forward. I didn't have a lot that I had to be regretting, but I did have some. I mean, otherwise, I mean, what? I could be brought into church and be kept from sin? No, I'm a sinner. I was a sinner. So I'm always concerned about those that were in the church all their lives and maybe think that that saves them. You know, I was in a denomination that did that. You know, I was christened as a baby. I was confirmed at a certain age by going through a class, made me a member of the church. I was told I was okay with God. Yeah, it's scary to me because I wasn't. And I was deceived, personally and corporately, you know, by the organization. We're going to stop. This is your overview. Starting into next week, we will start looking into the attributes of God. I'm going to love this, guys. Y'all are going to hear that from me a lot. I love listening and learning about the sovereignty of God. We're going to watch the video. We'll get our food. Come back next week, Lord willing, and there's no snow on the ground. Roads are clear. And then we'll close with prayer.